My husband moved his girlfriend into our family home while I was visiting my dying mother. What he didn't know was the property records would arrive today, and he's about to learn who really owns the house he's playing house in. The manila envelope felt unnaturally heavy in my hands as I sat in my car, parked across the street from what used to be my sanctuary. Our 3-bedroom craftsman with the wraparound porch and the garden I'd spent 5 years perfecting. The home Steven and I had searched for during 6 months of weekend open houses, where we'd planned to raise our family, host Christmas dinners, and grow old together. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now there was a strange car in the driveway. A sleek red convertible that screamed midlife crisis, parked right where I used to park my sensible sedan. Through the large bay window, I could see movement, a flash of blonde hair that didn't belong to anyone in my family. The sound of laughter drifted across the lawn, carried on the early autumn breeze. His laughter intertwined with hers, a sound I hadn't heard in months, not directed at anything I'd said or done. I opened the envelope and pulled out the property records one more time, though I'd already memorized every word. My name, and only my name, listed as the legal owner. A wedding gift from my grandmother, who had insisted on this one peculiarity that had seemed so unnecessary at the time. Men come and go, Lydia, she'd said, with the wisdom of someone who'd outlived 2 husbands. But property is forever. Keep this one in your name alone. I'd laughed it off then, assured her that Steven and I were different. That ours was a love story for the ages. That we'd never need such precautions. My grandmother had simply smiled, patted my hand, and said, "Humor an old woman." Now, 6 years later, I silently thanked her for her foresight as I slipped the documents back into the envelope and stepped out of the car. The walk to my own front door felt surreal, like I was floating above myself, watching a stranger approach. A house that no longer felt like home. I hadn't been here in 3 weeks, not since I'd received the call about my mother's stroke and rushed to be at her bedside in Milwaukee. 3 weeks of hospital corridors, of watching machines breathe for the woman who had raised me, of sleeping in uncomfortable chairs and subsisting on vending machine coffee. 3 weeks in which Steven had apparently decided to completely rewrite our life story. My key still worked in the lock. Small mercies. I pushed open the door and stepped into the entryway, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors I'd selected, and Steven had installed over a long holiday weekend 3 summers ago. The laughter stopped abruptly. There was hurried whispering, the sound of something being knocked over, and then Steven appeared in the doorway to the living room, his face a mask of shock, and something that might have been guilt, though it was hard to tell with Steven these days. "Lydia," he said, my name sounding foreign on his lips. "You're back." "Evidently," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "My mother died yesterday morning." A flicker of something, perhaps genuine sympathy, crossed his face before it was replaced by the careful neutrality he'd perfected in recent months. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, and for a moment, he almost sounded like the man I'd married. Then his eyes darted nervously toward the living room, and the moment was gone. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon." Clearly, a woman appeared, behind him then, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. Tall and willowy, with the kind of blonde hair that required regular appointments to maintain. She was younger than me, of course she was, but not by as much as I'd feared. She wore yoga pants and one of Steven's college sweatshirts, the faded blue one I used to steal on lazy Sunday mornings. Hi," she said, offering an awkward wave. "I'm Anna." Of course she was Anna. Of course she had a name and a voice and a life that had somehow become entangled with mine without my knowledge or consent. She was no longer just the woman from Steven's Instagram posts. The anonymous blonde colleague he'd mentioned with increasing frequency over dinner conversations. She had a name, and she was wearing my husband's clothes in my house. You must be the marketing consultant, I said, my tone deliberately light. Steven's mentioned working closely with you on the new campaign. Anna's eyes widened slightly, darting to Steven, who had gone very still beside her. Lydia, he began, a warning note in his voice that I chose to ignore. What I can't quite figure out, I continued, setting my purse down on the entryway table with deliberate care, is why the marketing consultation appears to be happening in our bedroom. I gestured toward the stairs, where several items of clothing had been hastily tossed. A silk blouse in a shade of pink I'd never wear, a single high-heeled shoe that definitely wasn't mine. Anna had the grace to look embarrassed, a flush creeping up her neck and into her cheeks. Steven, on the other hand, seemed to recover some of his composure, drawing himself up to his full height, his jaw setting in the stubborn way that had once been endearing, but now just made me want to scream. I think we should talk privately, he said, glancing meaningfully at Anna, who immediately nodded. I should go, she murmured, already backing toward the stairs. I'll just grab my things. Don't rush on my account, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. After all, I'm the unexpected guest here, aren't I? Steven's eyes narrowed. This isn't like you, Lydia. You don't do confrontation. And he was right. The old Lydia, the Lydia who had existed 3 weeks ago, before her mother's stroke, before finding her husband playing house with another woman, that Lydia had avoided conflict at all costs. She had swallowed her disappointments, rationalized Steven's increasingly late nights at the office, and ignored the growing distance between them. But that Lydia had sat by her mother's hospital bed for 21 days, watching the strongest woman she knew fight for every breath, only to lose the battle in the end. That Lydia had held her mother's hand as it grew cold, promised to live more boldly, to stop accepting scraps of happiness. That Lydia was gone, replaced by someone even I didn't fully recognize yet. People change, I said simply. Anna reappeared, clutching a small overnight bag, her face still flushed with embarrassment. I'll call you later, she murmured to Steven, not quite meeting his eyes. Neither of us moved as she sidled past me and out the front door, the soft click of its closing somehow more final than a slam would have been. Steven ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I'd once found endearing, and sighed heavily. This isn't how I wanted you to find out. I almost laughed. And how exactly did you plan for me to discover that you'd moved your girlfriend into our home? A text message, a cheerful note on the refrigerator. It's not like that, he insisted, though we both knew it was exactly like that. Anna and it just happened. I wasn't looking for this. They never are, I replied, echoing my grandmother's words from long ago. And yet somehow it always manages to just happen. Especially when wives are conveniently out of town. Steven's expression hardened. Your mother's illness was hardly convenient, Lydia. But you've been gone for weeks. You barely called. What? Did you expect? The audacity of his question momentarily robbed me of speech. I stared at him, this stranger wearing my husband's face, and wondered how I had missed the transformation. When had the man who had held me through my father's funeral, who had once driven 4 hours to bring me my favorite soup when I was sick with the flu, become someone who could blame me for his infidelity because I was caring for my dying mother? I expected basic human decency, I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. I expected the vows we made to mean something. I expected you to be the man I thought I married. He had the grace to look away, his gaze fixing on some point beyond my shoulder. People change, he said, throwing my own words back at me. We've been growing apart for years, Lydia. You just haven't wanted to see it. Perhaps there was some truth to that. Perhaps I had ignored the warning signs, made excuses for his emotional absence, convinced myself that every marriage went through rough patches, but that didn't justify what he'd done. So your solution was to move your girlfriend into our home while I was sitting vigil at my mother's deathbed? I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to keep it steady. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's your idea of addressing marital problems? Steven's jaw tightened. It wasn't planned. Her lease ended and it seemed convenient, I finished for him. How wonderfully convenient for both of you. I want a divorce, he said abruptly, the words hanging in the air between us like a physical thing. I was going to tell you when you got back. Anna isn't just some fling, Lydia. We're serious about each other. I should have been devastated. Some distant part of me recognized that this moment, my husband declaring his love for another woman in the home we had built together, should have broken me. But instead, I felt an odd sense of calm, almost relief. The uncertainty was gone. The pretense was over. I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope. As it happens, I said, I have some paperwork of my own to discuss. Steven eyed the envelope warily. What's that? Property records, I replied, holding them, out to him. My grandmother's wedding gift to me. Not to us, as it turns out. To me, alone. He took the envelope with visible reluctance, his brow furrowing as he scanned the documents inside. I watched the realization dawn on his face, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. This house is in your name, he said slowly. Just your name? Yes. But we bought it together. I helped with the down payment. You contributed to the down payment, I corrected him. As clearly documented in the gift letter, my grandmother's, lawyer prepared, a gift that was factored into the ownership arrangement she insisted upon. Steven's face darkened. You knew about this all along? I knew the house was in my name, I acknowledged. But I never thought it would matter. I never thought we'd be here. I gestured vaguely between us, encompassing all that had broken. I never thought you'd move another woman into my house. Our house, he insisted, but the words sounded hollow even to him, I could tell. No, Steven, I said quietly. My house. And I'd like you to leave? Steven stared at me, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. This wasn't how he had expected this confrontation to go. He had expected tears, pleading, perhaps even forgiveness. He had expected the Lydia who had always accommodated his needs, who had made excuses for his failings, who had prioritized his happiness above her own. That Lydia was gone. You can't just kick me out, he said, his voice rising. I have rights. I'm your husband. For now, I agreed. But the property laws are quite clear on this point. I've spoken with a lawyer. This was a lie. I had done no such thing. But Steven didn't need to know that. Not yet. When? He demanded. When did you have time to speak with a lawyer while your mother was dying? I made time, I said simply. Just like you made time for Anna while I was gone. Steven's face cycled through a series of emotions, shock, anger, calculation, and finally, a forced calm that I recognized from our most heated arguments. It was the expression he wore when he thought he could reason his way out of a situation. You're upset, he said, his voice deliberately gentle. And you have every right to be. Finding out about Anna this way, I handled it badly. But we need to talk about this rationally. I'm being perfectly rational, I replied, moving past him toward the kitchen. I needed water, needed to ground. Myself in the mundane act of opening my own refrigerator, using my own glass. Small rituals to remind myself that this was still my home, despite the alien presence that had invaded it. I noticed immediately that things had been rearranged. My organized refrigerator now contained unfamiliar yogurt brands, a carton of almond milk, which Steven had always claimed to hate, and several meal prep containers labeled in flowing handwriting that wasn't mine. In my absence, Anna had made herself comfortable in more ways than one. 3 weeks, I murmured, taking in the evidence of how thoroughly another woman had inserted herself into my life in such a short time. Steven had followed me and was leaning against the doorframe, watching me with cautious eyes. "What?" "It took you 3 weeks to replace me," I said, turning to face him. "My mother was dying, and you were playing house with your marketing consultant. Did you even think about me at all during that time?" A flash of guilt crossed his face. "Of course I did. I called you." "Twice, Steven. You called twice in 3 weeks, and both calls lasted less than 5 minutes." He had the grace to look away. "I texted too. How's it going?" "Doesn't count as emotional support while I'm watching." "My mother died," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice when inside I felt like I was shattering. "But I guess you were too busy redecorating our bedroom to manage anything more substantial." At the mention of our bedroom, Steven's expression changed, becoming more guarded. "This isn't productive, Lydia. We need to discuss the house situation." Calmly. "The house situation," I repeated. "You mean the fact that you moved your girlfriend into a house that legally belongs to me? That house situation?" "It's more complicated than that," he insisted. "We're married. I've been paying the mortgage." "Half the mortgage," I corrected him, "on a house that's worth 3 times what we paid for it, thanks to the renovations I coordinated and the neighborhood improvements I fought for on the community board you were too busy to join." I watched as he calculated, reassessing the situation and his position in it. Steven had always been strategic, one of the qualities that had made him successful in his career as a financial advisor. I could practically see him running the numbers, weighing his options. "We should both take some time to cool off," he finally said. "I'll go to a hotel for a few days. We can talk when things aren't so raw." "That's very considerate," I said, not bothering to hide the sarcasm in my voice. "Will Anna be joining you at this hotel, or does she have somewhere else to go now that her lease has so conveniently ended?" His jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "None of this is fair, Steven. My mother is dead. My husband has betrayed me in the most cliched way possible, and a stranger has been sleeping in my bed. So forgive me if I'm not particularly concerned with fairness right now." I moved to the kitchen island and set my glass down, noticing for the first time that the framed photos that had once lined the windowsill, pictures of our wedding, our honeymoon, the life we'd built together, had been removed. In their place stood a potted orchid I'd never seen before. The absence of those photos hit me harder than finding Anna in my house. It was one thing to betray me. It was another to erase me. "Where are our photos?" I asked, my voice barely above, a whisper. Steven shifted uncomfortably. "In the office closet." It seemed weird to have them up. "Weird," I repeated. "Yes, I imagine it would be weird to have photographic evidence of your marriage while your girlfriend is living here." "Lydia, I want you to pack a bag and leave," I cut him off. "Tonight, I'll give you 30 minutes. His expression hardened. "You can't just throw me out. I have rights." "And I have a property deed with only my name on it," I countered. "Along with text messages from you acknowledging that you've moved another woman into my home without my knowledge or consent. Would you like to test which one a judge will find more compelling?" It was a bluff. I had no idea what a judge would say, and the legal realities were almost certainly more complicated than I was making them out to be. But I was counting on Steven's aversion to public embarrassment and his general tendency to avoid confrontation when he wasn't in a position of power. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw a glimpse of something I'd never seen directed at me before. A cold, calculating anger that made me glad we were in an open kitchen with clear sightlines to the front door. "This isn't over," he finally said. "No," I agreed. "But this part is." 30 minutes, Steven." He turned without another word and headed upstairs. I listened to his footsteps, the familiar creak of the third step, the sound of drawers opening and closing. Sounds that had once been comforting in their domesticity, now loaded with tension and finality. I sank onto one of the kitchen stools, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that had as much to do with my 3 weeks at the hospital as with the current situation. My phone buzzed in my purse. I retrieved it to find a text from Joan, my oldest friend, and the only person who had known I was coming home today. "Did you make it home safe?" I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. What could I possibly say? "Home safe, but found my husband's. Girlfriend has moved in," seemed both inadequate and melodramatic. Instead, I typed, "We need to talk. Can you come over tomorrow?" Her response was immediate. "That bad?" "I can come now." I hesitated. Part of me wanted Joan here, wanted the buffer of a loyal friend as Steven packed his things. But another part of me needed to do this alone, to stand on my own 2 feet as I reclaimed my space. "Tomorrow is better. I'll explain then." "Okay, but call if you need me. Anytime." I set the phone down as Steven reappeared in the kitchen doorway, a large suitcase in one hand and a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. "I'll need to come back for the rest of my things," he said stiffly. "We can arrange a time," I replied, "when I'm not here." He nodded, then hesitated. "Lydia, about the mortgage payment due next week." "I'll handle it," I cut him off, not wanting to have a financial discussion now. "Just like I'll handle my mother's funeral arrangements, alone." A flash of what might have been genuine remorse crossed his face. "I am sorry about your mother. I know how close you were." The sincerity in his voice threatened to crack my composure. This was the problem with long relationships. Even in moments of betrayal, there were threads of real connection, genuine understanding that couldn't be easily severed. "Thank you," I managed, "but that doesn't change where we are now." He shifted the suitcase to his other hand. "I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce." Fine. Neither of us seemed to know how to end this bizarre interaction. In movies, there would be a dramatic exit, a slamming door, perhaps even a tearful plea. But real life rarely provided such clean endings. Instead, there was just this awkward moment. 2 people who had once promised to love each other forever, now standing in their shared kitchen, unable to find the right words to close this chapter. "Goodbye, Lydia," he finally said, and walked out. I listened to his footsteps across the hardwood floor, the sound of the front door opening and closing. Through the kitchen window, I watched him load his suitcase into the trunk of his car, his movements mechanical. He didn't look back at the house as he drove away. Only when his taillights had disappeared down the street did I allow myself to truly feel the magnitude of what had just happened. My husband was gone. My marriage was over. My mother was dead. And I was alone in a house that no longer felt like home, surrounded by evidence of another woman's brief tenancy. The tears came then, not the delicate, dignified weeping of a wronged wife in a movie, but ugly, gut-wrenching sobs that bent me double over the kitchen island. I cried for my mother, for the marriage I'd thought I had, for the future I'd planned and lost. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen, until there seemed to be no tears left in my body. When the storm of grief finally passed, I straightened up, wiped my face, and took a deep breath. Then I went to the sink, filled a bucket with hot, soapy water, found rubber gloves under the sink, and began to clean. I stripped the sheets from our bed, my bed now, and stuffed them into the washing machine. I scrubbed the bathroom, erasing every trace of the woman who had briefly occupied my space. I returned the photos to the kitchen windowsill, reclaiming my history. It was nearly midnight when I finally collapsed onto the freshly made bed, physically exhausted, but mentally alert. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, calls to lawyers, conversations with friends, the bleak business of arranging my mother's funeral. But tonight, I had reclaimed my home. It was a small victory, but right now, I would take whatever wins I could get. As I drifted toward sleep, one thought crystallized in my mind. This was just the beginning. Steven thought he had the upper hand because he'd chosen to leave, because he'd been the one to say the word divorce first. But he had underestimated me, just as he had underestimated the legal protections my grandmother had put in place years ago. He would regret that mistake. I would make sure of it. Morning arrived with harsh clarity, sunlight streaming through curtains I hadn't bothered to close the night before. For a blissful moment between sleep and wakefulness, I forgot everything: my mother's death, Steven's betrayal, the collapse of my marriage. Then reality crashed back, and I lay still, letting the weight of it settle over me like a heavy blanket. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from Joan. "Coming over at 10 with coffee and bagels. No is not an option." I smiled weakly. Joan had been my friend since college, the person who'd stood beside me through every major life event, including my wedding to Steven. She'd never particularly liked him, a fact she'd diplomatically kept to herself except for one drunken confession during my bachelorette party. "He's too polished," she'd said, her words slightly slurred, like he's always performing. I had dismissed her concerns as typical pre-wedding jitters by proxy. Now I wondered if she'd seen something in him that I'd been too blinded by love to recognize. I dragged myself out of bed and into the shower, letting the hot water wash away the tear stains and exhaustion. By the time Joan arrived, promptly at 10, I had managed to dress and even apply minimal makeup, a small act of defiance against the chaos of my life. "Holy shit," Joan said by way of greeting when I opened the door. She thrust a cardboard tray of coffee cups into my hands and pulled me into a fierce hug. "You look like hell warmed over, but at least you're upright." "Thanks for the assessment," I replied, but found myself leaning into her embrace, drawing strength from the familiar scent of her perfume and the solid warmth of her friendship. Inside, Joan moved through my kitchen with practiced ease, arranging bagels on a plate, finding cream cheese in the fridge, thankfully one item Anna hadn't replaced with her organic alternatives. She didn't ask questions right away, giving me space to gather my thoughts as we settled at the kitchen island with our breakfast. "So," she finally said, after I'd taken a few bites and several sips of coffee, "what happened? And why didn't you tell me you were coming home yesterday?" I took a deep breath and told her everything: finding Anna in my house, the confrontation with Steven, the property records, kicking him out. Joan listened without interrupting, though her expressions cycled through shock, outrage, and fierce approval. "That absolute bastard," she said when I finished. "Moving his girlfriend in while you're with your dying mother? That's a special kind of low." I nodded, grateful for her validation. "I still can't quite believe it happened. Part of me keeps expecting to wake up and find this was all some bizarre nightmare." "Trust me, you're awake," Joan assured me. "And you handled it like a boss. I can't believe you actually kicked him out." "I had the property records," I reminded her. "Without those, I'm not sure I would have had the courage." Joan reached across the island and squeezed my hand. "Don't sell yourself short. You've been finding your backbone for a while now. Remember last Christmas when you finally told your mother-in-law to stop criticizing your cooking? The property records just gave you leverage, not courage." I smiled weakly at the memory. Steven's mother had been appalled by my assertiveness, though Steven had actually backed me up for once. It seemed like such a small victory now. "So what's your next move?" Joan asked, refilling our coffee cups. "I need to call a lawyer," I said, voicing the thought that had been circling my mind since Steven had driven away. "Figure out what my rights actually are beyond the house. And I have to plan my mother's funeral. The hospital is still holding her." I trailed off, unable to say the word body. Joan nodded. "I'll help with the funeral arrangements. And I know a good divorce attorney, Kelly Reynolds. She handled my cousin's divorce last year. Absolute shark in the courtroom, but the sweetest person otherwise." I took out my phone and made a note of the name. "I'll call her today." What about your job? Joan asked gently. Do you need to extend your leave? The question jarred me. In the shock of everything that had happened, I'd barely thought about my position as an architectural project manager at a firm downtown. I'd taken emergency family leave when my mother had her stroke, but that time was running out. I should call them, I admitted. I need at least another week to handle the funeral and everything else. Do it, Joan urged. And then call Kelly. Getting legal protection should be your priority right now. After Joan left, armed with promises that I would call if I needed anything, I followed her advice. My boss was understanding about extending my leave, offering condolences about my mother and assuring me my projects could wait. I didn't mention the collapse of my marriage. One personal crisis seemed sufficient explanation for needing more time off. Then I called Kelly Reynolds' office and managed to secure a consultation for the following morning, the receptionist squeezing me in after I mentioned Joan's referral and briefly explained my situation. With those immediate tasks handled, I turned to the grim business of contacting the funeral home in Milwaukee where my mother's body had been transferred. The director was professional and compassionate, guiding me through options for services and burial arrangements. We settled on a small ceremony 3 days later, which would give distant relatives time to make travel arrangements if they wished to attend. By late afternoon, I had made a dozen calls, sent countless emails, and created a detailed to-do list that would carry me through the next several days. The activity had kept the worst of my grief and shock at bay, giving me purpose and direction when I might otherwise have collapsed. But as evening approached, bringing with it the peculiar silence of an empty house, the weight of everything I'd lost pressed down on me again. On impulse, I reached for my phone and pulled up Steven's contact information. Despite everything, some irrational part of me still wanted to talk to the person who had been my partner for nearly a decade, who had stood beside me when my father died, who knew my history and my heart in ways no one else did. Before I could talk myself out of it, I pressed call. He answered on the third ring, his voice cautious. Lydia? I need to talk to you, I said, hating the tremor in my voice. About what happens next. I told you my lawyer will contact you, he replied, his tone deliberately neutral. I'm not talking about the divorce, I clarified. I'm talking about my mother's funeral. It's on Saturday in Milwaukee. I thought you might want to be there. The silence that followed was deafening. Despite everything, I had expected him to offer support, to slip back into the role of the caring husband he had once been. It was ridiculous, I knew, given the circumstances, but grief rarely follows rational paths. I don't think that's a good idea, he finally said. Under the circumstances. The circumstances where you betrayed me while my mother was dying? I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. Lydia, don't do this, he sighed. We're both hurting right now. Adding more conflict won't help either of us. I'm not trying to add conflict, I insisted. I'm trying to find some way to navigate this impossible situation. My mother loved you, Steven. She considered you her son. And I cared about her too, he said, sounding genuinely regretful. But things have changed between us. My being at the funeral would just create tension when you need to focus on saying goodbye to your mom. His reasonable tone infuriated me more than anger would have. Things haven't changed, Steven. You changed them. You made choices that destroyed our marriage. At least have the decency to own that. I never meant to hurt you, he said, falling back on the classic line of unfaithful spouses everywhere. But you did hurt me, I replied. And now you're refusing to support me when I need it most. Another silence, then. Anna and I are leaving. Town for a few days, a mini vacation we planned before I knew you'd be back so soon. The tickets are non-refundable. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only was he refusing to attend my mother's funeral, but he was going on vacation with his girlfriend instead. The complete disregard for my feelings, for common decency, was breathtaking. "You're going on vacation," I repeated, my voice flat. "While I bury my mother." "Lydia, don't," I cut him off. "Don't say another word. I don't want to hear your excuses or your rationalizations. Just don't." I ended the call before he could respond, then sat motionless, staring at the wall across from me. Whatever foolish hope I'd harbored that there might be some path to reconciliation, some way to salvage even a shred of the relationship we'd once had, evaporated in that moment. Steven wasn't just moving on. He had already moved on long before I'd discovered his betrayal. And I was utterly, completely alone in facing the days ahead. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it solidified something in my core, a determination that had been forming since I'd first seen Anna in my house. If Steven could discard a decade of marriage so easily, if he could abandon me during the most painful experience of my life, then I owed him nothing. Not consideration, not kindness, and certainly not forgiveness. I picked up my phone again and called Joan. "I need that lawyer's home number," I said when she answered. "I can't wait until tomorrow." The day of my mother's funeral dawned gray and drizzly, the Milwaukee sky weeping the tears I was too numb to shed. I stood in the small chapel attached to the funeral home, greeting distant relatives and my mother's colleagues with mechanical politeness, accepting hugs and condolences with a detached smile that never reached my eyes. Joan had driven up with me the day before, handling all the logistics I couldn't manage, arranging the modest flower display my mother would have preferred, coordinating with the minister, making sure the memorial pamphlets were printed correctly. Now she stood beside me, a silent pillar of support, squeezing my elbow gently whenever my composure threatened to crack. "Your mother would be proud of you," she whispered, as we took our seats for the service. "You're handling this with such grace." But grace was the last thing I felt as I sat through the eulogies and prayers. Inside, I was a hurricane of rage and grief, fury at Steven's absence mingling with the raw pain of my mother's loss until I could barely distinguish between the two. When it came time for me to speak, I managed to deliver the words I'd carefully prepared, sharing memories of my mother's strength, her humor, her unwavering support. But it felt like someone else was speaking through me, some automaton who could function while the real Lydia huddled in a dark corner of my mind, screaming into the void. After the service, after the burial, after the small reception at my mother's favorite restaurant, Joan and I returned to my childhood home, now mine, another inheritance I hadn't wanted. We walked through the quiet rooms, the air still heavy with my mother's presence. Her books stacked beside her reading chair, her gardening shoes by the back door, her half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen table. "I can't stay here tonight," I said suddenly, the words escaping before I'd fully formed the thought. "It's too—" "I know," Joan cut in, sparing me from having to articulate the suffocating weight of absence that filled the house. "We'll get a hotel. We can come back tomorrow to start sorting things." But even the bland anonymity of the hotel room offered little respite. As soon as Joan fell asleep in the adjacent bed, the dam I'd built around my emotions began to crack. I slipped into the bathroom, turned on the shower to mask any sounds, and finally allowed myself to break down completely. I cried for my mother, for the conversations we'd never have, for the milestones she'd never witness. I cried for my marriage, for the life I'd thought I was building, for the children Steven and I had talked about having someday, children who would now never exist. I cried until I was empty, hollowed out, a shell of the woman I'd been just a month ago. When I finally emerged, face raw from tears and hotel washcloth, Joan was sitting up in bed, the bedside lamp casting her in gentle light. "I heard you," she said simply. "Do you want to talk about it?" I shook my head, then changed my mind and nodded, collapsing onto my bed. "Everything is gone, Joan. My mother, my marriage, the future I planned. It's all just gone. She moved to sit beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. I know it feels that way right now, but you're still here, and you can build a new future. I don't know how, I admitted, the words barely audible. I've spent the last decade being Steven's wife, being my mother's daughter. Who am I without them? You're Lydia, Joan said firmly, the woman who redesigned her entire kitchen from scratch because she couldn't find exactly what she wanted. The woman who organized a community fundraiser to save the local library. The woman who just faced the worst day of her life with more strength than most people show in a lifetime. I let her words wash over me, wanting desperately to believe them, but feeling disconnected from the person she was describing. That Lydia seemed like a distant acquaintance, someone I'd known long ago but could barely remember now. I feel like I'm drowning, I confessed. Every time I think I've hit bottom, the floor drops out again. Joan's arm tightened around me. Then I'll be your life raft. And when you're ready, I'll help you find your way back to shore. But right now, you just need to keep your head above water. We sat in silence for a long moment, the hotel air conditioning humming softly in the background. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me since Steven's revelation about his vacation. Do you think he ever really loved me? Joan sighed, considering her answer carefully. I think he loved the idea of you. The perfect wife who supported his career, who made a beautiful home, who never demanded too much. But I don't know if he ever truly saw you, the real you, with all your dreams and fears and complications. Her words pierced me with their truth. Steven had always seemed most attentive, most loving, when I was fulfilling the role he expected. The admiring wife, the gracious hostess, the understanding partner who accepted his late nights at work without question. The times I'd stepped outside that role, when I'd pursued my own career advancement, when I'd disagreed with him publicly, when I'd needed emotional support rather than offering it, those were the times tension had crept into our relationship. Was such a fool, I whispered. No, Joan said firmly. You were a woman who loved deeply and trusted completely. That's not foolish, Lydia. That's beautiful. Steven's the fool for throwing it away. We returned to our separate beds eventually, but sleep eluded me. I stared at the textured hotel ceiling, my mind racing through the ruins of my life, searching for some path forward that didn't terrify me. My buzzing phone broke the night stillness. I grabbed it quickly, not wanting to wake Joan, and frowned at the unknown number lighting up my screen. It was nearly 2 a.m. Who would be calling at this hour? Hello? I answered cautiously. Is this Lydia Calloway? The woman's voice was unfamiliar, her tone professional but gentle. Yes. Who's this? My name is Officer Rivera with the Milwaukee Police Department. I'm calling about your property on Maple Street. My mother's house. My house now. My heartbeat accelerated. What about it? I'm afraid there's been a break-in, she said. The alarm system alerted us and we responded, but the intruders had already fled. There's significant damage, and we need you to come assess what might be missing. I sat up, fully alert now. I'll be there as soon as I can. 20 minutes, maybe. After hanging up, I woke Joan and explained the situation. We dressed quickly and drove through the quiet Milwaukee streets, my mind cycling through terrible scenarios. Had it been random vandals? Thieves who knew the house was empty after the funeral? Or something more targeted? The police cruiser was still parked outside when we arrived, lights silently flashing, illuminating the block in alternating blue and red. Officer Rivera, a petite woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, met us on the porch. The damage is mostly in the study and master bedroom, she explained as she led us inside. Drawers emptied, furniture overturned. It looks like they were searching for something specific. She was right. The living room and kitchen were untouched, but my mother's study was devastated. Desk drawers pulled out and dumped, books swept from shelves, the small safe in the closet pried open and emptied. The safe, I said numbly. What was in it? We were hoping you could tell us, Officer Rivera replied. I shook my head. I don't know. My mother never shared the combination with me. I was planning to hire someone to open it next week. The bedroom was even worse. The mattress had been slashed, the contents of every drawer strewn across the floor. My mother's jewelry box lay empty on the dresser, the modest collection of pieces she'd treasured. Her wedding ring, my grandmother's pearls, the sapphire bracelet my father had given her on their anniversary. All gone. This wasn't random, Joan said quietly as we surveyed the damage. Random burglars don't slash mattresses. They were looking for something. Officer Rivera nodded. That's our assessment as well. Ms. Calloway, can you think of anything your mother might have had that someone would want this badly? Documents, valuables we can't see are missing? I shook my head, overwhelmed by this fresh violation on a day already marked by grief. No, nothing. She was a community college professor. She didn't have enemies or secrets. But even as I said, the words I remembered my mother's last coherent conversation before the stroke had robbed her of speech. She'd been agitated, insisting I look in her safe after she was gone. There's something you need to see, she'd said. Something about Steven. I'd assumed it was delirium, her mind confusing past and present. Now I wasn't so sure. Actually, I said slowly, there might have been something, but I don't know what. As Officer Rivera took notes and promised increased patrols in the area, I stood in the wreckage of my mother's life, a terrible suspicion forming in my mind. The timing was too perfect, too coincidental. A break-in the night after the funeral, targeting the safe my mother had specifically mentioned in relation to Steven. Do you think, Joan began once we were alone, clearly following the same trail of thought. I don't know what to think anymore, I cut her off, unwilling to voice the accusation forming in my mind. That my husband might have orchestrated this, might have sent someone to steal whatever evidence my mother had been keeping. It was too painful, too outrageous to consider. And yet, as I looked around at the calculated destruction, the targeted search, I couldn't dismiss the possibility. The Steven I thought I knew would never do such a thing. But then, the Steven I thought I knew wouldn't have moved his girlfriend into our home while I sat by my mother's deathbed. I didn't know my husband at all. And that realization, more than the break-in, more than even my mother's death, made me feel truly, devastatingly alone. After the police finished documenting the break-in, Joan and I retreated to a 24-hour diner nearby, neither of us willing to stay in the violated space of my mother's home. We sat in a booth by the window, warming our hands on ceramic mugs of mediocre coffee as dawn slowly brightened the sky outside. Itaw. Should call Kelly, Joan said, breaking the exhausted silence that had settled between us. Tell her about the break-in. She needs to know what's happening. I nodded, too drained to argue. Kelly Reynolds, the divorce attorney I'd consulted before leaving for Milwaukee, had already impressed me with her sharp mind and strategic thinking. She'd advised me to document everything, to communicate with Steven only in writing when possible, and to prepare for what she called guerrilla warfare in the divorce proceedings. He's already shown he doesn't respect boundaries, she'd told me during our meeting. Men like that rarely play fair when their control is threatened. At the time, I'd thought she was being overly dramatic, projecting past clients' experiences onto my situation. Now, staring at my distorted reflection in the diner window, I wondered if she'd understood Steven better after one conversation than I had after a decade of marriage. I'll call her when it's a reasonable hour, I promised. But I need to figure out what was in that safe first. Joan frowned. How? It was cleaned out. Not everything requires physical evidence, I said, an idea forming. My mother may have been secretive, but she was also methodical. If she knew something about Steven, she would have documented it. And you think you know where to look? I nodded. Her backup drive. She kept everything on it. Research, photos, personal documents. She was paranoid about losing her work, so she updated it religiously. I managed a weak smile. Who knew her digital hoarding might actually come in? Handy? Where is it? Joan asked. In her office at the college. She kept it in her desk drawer. We can go there today. We made plans to visit the campus after getting a few hours of sleep, then return to the hotel. But despite my exhaustion, rest eluded me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. What had my mother discovered about Steven? Was it connected to his betrayal, or something else entirely? And was he desperate enough to orchestrate a break-in to keep it hidden? By 9 o'clock, I gave up on sleep and headed for the shower. Joan joined me for a quick breakfast, and then we drove to Milwaukee Community College, where my mother had taught English literature for over 20 years. The English department chair, Dr. Warren, met us in the lobby. A tall man with kind eyes and a bow tie. He'd spoken at the funeral about my mother's dedication to her students and her brilliant analytical mind. Lydia, my dear, he said, enfolding me in a gentle hug. I'm so very sorry about what happened at the house. What a terrible thing to experience on top of everything else. News traveled fast in small academic circles, apparently. Thank you, I said. I was hoping I could collect some of my mother's personal items from her office, specifically her external hard drive. Of course, he assured me, leading us through the maze of hallways to the English department. We haven't touched anything yet. I told the administration you'd need time to go through her things before we cleared the office for the next professor. My mother's office was exactly as she'd left it 3 weeks ago when she'd suffered the stroke during office hours. Books lined every available surface. Post-it notes marked passages and texts she was reviewing, and student papers were stacked neatly in her inbox. Her presence was so palpable that for a moment, I half expected her to walk through the door, reading glasses perched on her nose, asking what I was doing there. I'll leave you to it, Dr. Warren said gently. Take all the time you need. And Lydia, your mother was immensely proud of you. She talked about you constantly. The simple statement hit me like a physical blow. I'd known my mother loved me, of course. But hearing that she'd spoken about me with such pride to her colleagues made her absence suddenly, acutely painful again. Once we were alone, Joan helped me search the desk drawers for the external drive. We found it exactly where I'd expected, in the bottom right drawer, nestled in its protective case. Now what? Joan asked as I held the small device in my palm. Now we need a computer, I said, glancing at my mother's desktop. But not here, somewhere private. We settled on the campus library, finding a quiet study room in the back where we could connect the drive to Joan's laptop. As the contents loaded, my hands trembled slightly. Whatever my mother had wanted me to find, I was about to discover. The drive was organized with my mother's characteristic precision. Folders labeled by semester, by research project, by personal category. I navigated to the personal section and found a folder simply titled Lydia. Inside were documents related to my education, my wedding, my career milestones. My mother had kept digital records of everything that mattered to her. And there, at Imao, the bottom of the list was a folder labeled Steven Evidence. Joan and I exchanged a look. Open it, she said softly. Inside were dozens of files, meticulously organized and dated. Financial records, screenshots of bank statements, photographs, email printouts. With growing disbelief, I clicked through document after document. The picture they painted becoming clearer and more disturbing with each new revelation. Oh my God, Joan whispered, reading over my shoulder. He's been embezzling from his clients. It was all there. Records of money moved from client accounts to offshore holdings, falsified investment reports, evidence of a long-running scheme that had apparently funded the lifestyle I'd thought was supported by his legitimate income as a financial advisor. But that wasn't the worst of it. There were also photographs, Steven with Anna, dating back more than 2 years. Images of them entering hotels, dining at restaurants, even vacationing together in locations Steven had claimed to be visiting for business conferences. She wasn't. "Just some recent fling," I said numbly. "They've been together for years. Our entire marriage." The final folder contained something even more devastating. A birth certificate for a child, dated 18 months ago. Mother: Anna Marshall. Father: Stephen Calloway. "He has a child with her," I whispered, the world tilting beneath me. A baby. All this time. The implications crashed over me in waves. Steven hadn't just betrayed me with an affair. He'd built an entire parallel life with Anna. They had a child together, a fact he'd hidden while still sharing my bed, while still discussing having children with me someday. "I'm so sorry, Lydia," Joan said, her voice thick with anger and compassion. "This is beyond betrayal. There aren't even words for what this is." I sat back in the chair, struggling to process the magnitude of the deception. Every anniversary dinner, every weekend trip, every intimate moment we'd shared over the past 2 years, all of it had been a lie. While I'd been planning our future, Steven had already created one with someone else. That's why he was so desperate. "To get whatever was in my mother's safe," I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. She must have been investigating him, gathering evidence, but how did she know? How did she figure it out when I had no idea? "Your mother was brilliant," Joan reminded me. "And she was looking out for you. She always had." A new file caught my eye, a text document simply titled, "For Lydia." I clicked it open with trembling fingers and found a letter from my mother, dated just weeks before her stroke. "My dearest Lydia, if you're reading this, I'm either gone or have finally found the courage to show you the truth. I've spent months debating whether to share what I've discovered, not wanting to cause you pain, but I've come to believe that living in ignorance is ultimately more harmful than facing difficult truths." It began with a chance encounter. I saw Steven with a woman at a restaurant in Chicago when he was supposedly at a conference in New York. My first instinct was to confront him, but something held me back. Instead, I started paying attention, asking questions, following trails that led to the evidence I've compiled here. What you do with this information is, of course, entirely your decision. I know you love Steven, and I know how devastating this revelation will be. But you deserve to make choices based on reality, not illusion, no matter how painful that reality might be. You are stronger than you know, my darling girl. Whatever path you choose, remember that strength. Remember that you are your mother's daughter, and we do not break easily. All my love. Mom tears blurred my vision as I read her final words to me. Even in death, my mother was protecting me, guiding me, giving me the tools I needed to face an unthinkable betrayal. She knew, I whispered. All this time she knew, and she was gathering evidence to protect me. Joan squeezed my shoulder. "What are you going to do?" I stared at the screen, at the evidence of years of deception spread before me. The numbness that had enveloped me since the funeral was receding, replaced by something harder, colder, and infinitely more focused. "I'm going to make copies of everything," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "Then I'm going to call Kelly, and then—" I took a deep breath, feeling something shift within me, some fundamental transformation, taking root. "Then I'm going to make Steven wish he'd never betrayed either of us." Kelly Reynolds's office occupied the entire top floor of a historic building in downtown Milwaukee, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. The receptionist, a young man with impeccable fashion sense, led us through the glass doors, emblazoned with Reynolds Family Law, and into a conference room where Kelly was waiting. She rose to greet us, her tailored charcoal suit and sleek bob projecting exactly the kind of polished competence I needed. At 40-something, Kelly had the confident bearing of a woman who had faced down countless adversaries and emerged victorious. "I'm sorry about your mother," she said, her handshake firm. "And about the break-in." Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? I appreciated that she didn't pretend it was anything else. Not a coincidence at all, I replied, setting my laptop on the conference table. And I have proof. Over the next hour, Joan and I walked Kelly through the contents of my mother's external drive, the financial records documenting Steven's embezzlement, the evidence of his long-standing affair with Anna, and most damning of all, the birth certificate, confirming they had a child together. Kelly took meticulous notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly listening with an expression of growing calculation. I could almost see the strategic wheels turning behind her sharp eyes. "This changes everything," she said when we finished. "Your divorce just went from standard to significantly complex and potentially very advantageous for you." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Financial fraud during a marriage creates enormous leverage," Kelly explained, "especially when it's paired with evidence that someone has intentionally hidden assets, which your husband has clearly done. The courts take a very dim view of that behavior." "So what's our next step?" Joan asked, leaning forward. Kelly closed her notebook and tapped her pen against it thoughtfully. "We need to secure these documents legally. Right now, they're excellent intelligence, but we need to transform them into admissible evidence." "How do we do that?" I asked. "First, we file for an emergency court order to freeze your joint assets before Steven can move or hide them further. The evidence of embezzlement is compelling enough that a judge will likely grant it." She made a note. "Second, we get a forensic accountant to analyze these financial records and prepare expert testimony. I have someone I work with regularly who specializes in uncovering hidden assets in divorce cases." Kelly looked up at me, her expression serious. "However, we also need to consider the criminal implications. What your husband has done isn't just grounds for divorce, it's potentially criminal fraud. Are you prepared for where this might lead?" The question gave me pause. Was I ready to see Steven potentially face criminal charges? To be responsible for sending the father of my once-planned children to prison? 6 weeks ago, the very thought would have been unimaginable. But the man I discovered wasn't the man I'd married. He wasn't even the man I'd thought I was divorcing just days ago. "I need to think about that aspect," I said honestly. "But I want to use everything we have to protect myself and get what I'm entitled to." Kelly nodded. "That's fair. And strategically, the threat of criminal exposure often motivates very generous settlement offers. Sometimes more than what you'd get at trial." She stood and walked to a whiteboard mounted on the conference room wall. "Let's map out exactly what we're dealing with and what resources we'll need." Over the next 2 hours, Kelly methodically outlined our strategy, breaking it down into immediate actions, short-term goals, and long-term objectives. She assigned tasks with the efficiency of a military commander planning a complex operation. "You need a team," she explained as she wrote names and contact information on the whiteboard. "A forensic accountant to track the money trail, a private investigator to document the ongoing relationship and potentially uncover additional evidence, a financial advisor, one with no connection to Steven, to help you understand your current position and future needs." I watched as the list grew, feeling both overwhelmed and oddly reassured. For the first time since discovering Steven's betrayal, I felt like I had a roadmap, a way forward through the chaos. "What about the authorities?" Joan asked. "Should we report the embezzlement?" Kelly considered this. "That's Lydia's decision. But from a strategic perspective, having the evidence and decision of whether to report it creates significant leverage. Once it's reported, that leverage diminishes somewhat." She turned to me. "The other factor to consider is the impact on innocent parties, his clients who've been defrauded, for instance. There are ethical considerations beyond your divorce." Nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. "For now, I want to focus on protecting myself and establishing my legal position. We can decide about reporting later, when I have a clearer picture of everything." "Good," Kelly said approvingly. That gives us time to assemble the strongest possible case while maintaining maximum flexibility. She checked her watch. I need to file the emergency motion to freeze assets immediately. The temporary restraining order against removing or hiding marital property as well. Do you have time to review and sign the paperwork now? Of course, I said, grateful for her urgency. While Kelly stepped out to have her assistant prepare the documents, Joan squeezed my hand. You okay? This is a lot to process. I took a deep breath, considering the question. Was I okay? My mother was dead. My husband had betrayed me in ways I was still struggling to comprehend. My life had been upended completely in less than a month. No, I admitted. I'm not okay, but I'm going to be. For the first time, I actually believed it. Kelly returned with a stack of papers requiring my signature. As I read through the legal documents detailing the freeze on our joint accounts, the formal request for financial disclosures, and the petition for exclusive use of the family home, the reality of what was happening hit me anew. This wasn't a bad dream I would wake from. It was my life now. What happens when Steven gets served with these papers? I asked, signing the last document with a hand that trembled slightly. He'll likely contact his lawyer immediately, Kelly said, if he hasn't already retained one. Given the evidence we have, I expect they'll reach out quickly to discuss settlement options. And if they don't? Kelly's expression hardened slightly. Then we escalate. We can request an emergency hearing for temporary support and file for contempt if he attempts to circumvent the asset freeze. The judge assigned to your case will determine interim financial arrangements while the divorce proceeds. She gathered the signed documents. But understand this. Most divorce cases settle before trial, even contentious ones like yours. No one wants their dirty laundry aired in open court, especially someone with as much to hide as your husband. After finishing with Kelly, Joan and I met with the forensic accountant she'd recommended, Samuel Weiss, a former IRS investigator with a reputation for finding money others had worked hard to conceal. Financial criminals follow patterns, explained as he examined the documents I'd brought. Even sophisticated ones. Your husband's scheme is actually fairly common in the financial advisory world. Skimming from client accounts, creating false statements, using the embezzled funds to support a lifestyle beyond his legitimate means. Can you track exactly how much he's taken? I asked. Samuel nodded confidently. With these records as a starting point, absolutely. I'll need access to your joint tax returns for the past 7 years, bank statements, investment accounts, credit card statements, anything financial. Some of those are in the house in Portland, I said, realizing the logistical challenge of gathering everything while I was still in Milwaukee. I can help with that, Joan offered. I'll go back ahead of you, pack up what you need. I felt a rush of gratitude for her friendship. Are you sure? Positive, she affirmed. You focus on handling things here. I'll secure the documents. Our final meeting of the day was with Eric Daniels, the private investigator Kelly had recommended. Unlike Samuel's polished professionalism, Eric had the rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time in surveillance vehicles than offices. But his sharp eyes missed nothing, and he asked precise, thoughtful questions about Steven's habits, routines, and potential hiding places for assets. People think private investigators just follow cheating spouses around with cameras, he said, his voice gruff from what I guessed were years of cigarettes. But in cases like yours, it's more about documentation and verification, proving what's already happened and tracking ongoing activities that might affect your case. Like whether he's continuing to move money? I suggested. Eric nodded. Exactly. Or whether he's disposing of marital assets without your knowledge. I'll coordinate with Samuel on the financial surveillance aspects. By late afternoon, my head was spinning with information, strategies, and to-do lists. Kelly had mapped out a plan for the next 3 weeks that would keep me busy with depositions, financial reviews, and preparations for the initial divorce hearing. What should I do about the house in Portland? I asked as our marathon strategy session wound down. I need to go back there eventually. With the documentation we've filed today, your husband can't legally return to the house without your permission, Kelly assured me. We've established it as your separate property, and the court will almost certainly grant you exclusive use during the divorce proceedings. She hesitated, then added, "That said, given the break-in here and the level of deception we've uncovered, it might be prudent to change the locks and install a security system if you don't already have one." The suggestion sent a chill through me. I'd been so focused on the legal and financial aspects of Steven's betrayal that I hadn't fully considered the potential for more direct confrontations. "You think he might try to get in?" I asked. Kelly's expression was carefully neutral. "I think someone who has maintained a double life for years and potentially orchestrated a break-in is capable of further boundary violations. Better safe than sorry." As Joan and I drove back to the hotel, exhaustion finally catching up with me, I felt a strange mix of emotions. The grief over my mother was still raw, the betrayal still fresh. But beneath those painful feelings was something new, a sense of purpose, of forward momentum. "You did good today," Joan said, glancing over as she navigated through rush-hour traffic. "Your mom would be proud." I nodded, too tired for words, but sensing the truth in her statement. My mother had given me one final gift, the truth I needed to protect myself. Now it was up to me to use it wisely. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since returning to Milwaukee, dreamless and uninterrupted. When I woke the next morning, the path ahead still seemed daunting, but no longer impossible. I had a plan. I had resources. I had a team. Most importantly, I had myself, stronger, and more determined than I'd been before. Steven had underestimated me, just as he'd underestimated my mother. That was a mistake he would soon regret. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and preparations. I arranged my mother's affairs, signed documents authorizing Kelly to act on my behalf in my absence, and scheduled follow-ups with Samuel and Eric for the coming weeks. Joan had already flown back to Portland to secure the financial documents we needed and check on my house. On my final evening in Milwaukee, I returned to my mother's home, still bearing the scars of the break-in, but now cleaned up thanks to a service Kelly had recommended. I walked through the quiet rooms, running my fingers along the spines of my mother's beloved books, breathing in the lingering scent of her perfume that clung to her clothing. In her bedroom, I opened her jewelry box, now empty of its treasures. The loss of those family heirlooms stung, not for their monetary value but for the history they represented, tangible links to my grandmother, my great-grandmother, generations of women whose strength I carried in my blood. As I was about to close the drawer, something caught my eye. A small irregularity in the fabric lining. Curious, I pressed against it and felt a hard object beneath. Carefully, I peeled back the velvet to discover a small key taped to the bottom of the drawer, along with a note in my mother's handwriting. First National, Box 317. My heart raced as I realized what I'd found, the key to a safety deposit box I hadn't known existed. My mother, ever cautious, had created a backup plan even for her backup plan. Early the next morning, before my flight back to Portland, I visited First National Bank in downtown Milwaukee. The bank manager, after verifying my identity and my mother's death certificate, escorted me to the vault area where safety deposit boxes lined the walls. "Take all the time you need," he said, unlocking box 317 with his master key and my mother's key, then discreetly stepping away. Inside the box lay a small leather pouch and a sealed envelope with my name on it. I opened the envelope first, finding another letter from my mother. "My darling Lydia, if you're reading this, you've found the key and figured out its purpose. Always my clever girl. Inside the pouch are items too precious to leave unprotected. Your grandmother's wedding band, the locket with pictures of your father and me on our wedding day, and the sapphire earrings that have passed through our family for 4 generations. I've also included a flash drive containing copies of all the evidence about Steven, along with additional documentation you might need. The original property deed to your home in Portland showing your sole ownership, insurance policies, and several accounts I've established for you that Steven knows nothing about. You see, I've been preparing for this possibility longer than you might imagine. A mother senses things, and I sensed something wasn't right with your marriage years ago. Call it intuition, call it meddling. I prefer to think of it as protection. Look particularly at the Cayman Islands account information. The money there came from your grandmother's estate, funds I never told you about. I've been investing it quietly for years, building a safety net you might someday need. That day has apparently come. Remember who you are, Lydia. You come from a long line of women who bend but never break. All my love. Mom, with trembling hands, I opened the pouch and found exactly what she'd described. The family jewelry I'd thought, lost forever, along with a small flash drive. Relief washed over me, followed by a wave of gratitude for my mother's foresight. On the plane back to Portland, I reviewed the contents of the flash drive on my laptop. The Cayman account contained over $340,000, a sum that left me breathless. My mother and grandmother had created a financial safety net I'd never known about, ensuring I would never be trapped by financial dependency. Beyond the money, I discovered documentation of 3 rental properties in Milwaukee that my mother had purchased using the family funds, all producing steady income that had been reinvested over the years, property I now owned outright. Most significantly, I found detailed records of my mother's investigation into Steven's activities, notes on conversations with his colleagues, screenshots of social media posts that contradicted his claimed whereabouts, even recorded phone calls with financial institutions questioning discrepancies she'd identified. My mother hadn't just stumbled upon Steven's deception. She'd methodically investigated it over years, compiling evidence with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. The scope of her efforts was staggering, and exactly what Kelly needed to strengthen our position. I arrived in Portland late that evening, emotionally and physically exhausted, but with a newfound sense of security. Joan picked me up at the airport, bubbling with excitement she could barely contain. "I found something at your house," she blurted out as soon as I got in the car. "Something big." "What is it?" I asked, thinking nothing could surprise me after the revelations in my mother's safety deposit box. "Steven has a second phone," she explained. "It was hidden in his golf bag in the garage. I was looking for financial documents in his filing cabinet when I accidentally knocked over his clubs. The phone fell out of the side pocket." My pulse quickened. "Did you turn it on?" She nodded, a mixture of triumph and disgust on her face. "No password, if you can believe it. Arrogant bastard never thought anyone would find it. Lydia, it's full of texts between him and Anna going back 3 years. Photos, plans, everything." "Did you show it to Kelly's team?" I asked. "Better. Eric sent a tech guy who made a complete forensic copy before putting it back exactly where I found it. Steven has no idea we have access to his secret communications." I leaned back against the headrest, processing this new development. "So now we can see their conversations in real time?" "Exactly," Joan confirmed. "Eric's team is monitoring it. And Lydia, there's more. The texts mention other bank accounts, properties in Anna's name that Steven paid for. They've been planning this for years. How to hide assets, how to minimize what you'd get in a divorce." Instead of feeling devastated by this additional betrayal, I felt a strange sense of calm certainty. Every new revelation only confirmed what I already knew, that the man I'd married was a stranger, a carefully constructed facade hiding something rotten at the core. But now, for the first time, I had the advantage. While Steven believed he still controlled the narrative, still held all the cards, I was gathering resources and information he didn't know I possessed. His careful plans, his hidden assets, his secret communication, all of it now visible to me while he remained in the dark. He thinks I'm just the grieving, betrayed wife, I said quietly as we drove through the nighttime streets of Portland toward my house. He has no idea what's coming. Joan glanced at me, a smile spreading across her face. No, he really doesn't. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my mother's stroke, a sense of power, of agency over my own life. Steven had underestimated me, had counted on my compliance and ignorance. That mistake would cost him everything. The following morning, I woke in my own bed for the first time in nearly a month. The house felt different, cleaner somehow, without Steven's presence. Joan had not only gathered the financial documents we needed, but had also taken it upon herself to change the locks, install a security system, and remove every trace of Anna's brief residence. I burned the sheets, she'd admitted with a slightly manic gleam in her eye. Probably unnecessary, but extremely satisfying. Over coffee at my kitchen island, we connected with Kelly via video call to share the discoveries. From my mother's safety deposit box and the contents of Steven's secret phone, Kelly's professional composure cracked briefly, a smile of genuine delight crossing her face as she processed the implications. "This is extraordinary," she said, tapping notes into her tablet. "The hidden accounts in the Caymans, the real estate, holdings in Anna's name, the second phone. It's a perfect storm of discoverable assets and documented deception." "So what do we do with all of it?" I asked, cradling my coffee mug between my palms. Kelly's expression turned thoughtful. "We have multiple paths available, each with different advantages. The question is, what outcome are you seeking, Lydia? Maximum financial recovery? Public exposure? A swift resolution? The strategy changes depending on your primary goal." It was a question I'd been turning over since discovering the extent of Steven's betrayal. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? Simply to move on with my life? "I want 3 things," I said slowly, the objectives crystallizing as I spoke them aloud. "First, I want financial security. Everything I'm legally entitled to, plus compensation for his deception. Second, I want him to face consequences for what he's done, not just to me, but to his clients. And third," I paused, realizing the final goal was the most important to me. "I want the truth acknowledged, not hidden in confidential settlements or sealed court records, but publicly recognized. I'm tired of being the only one carrying the burden of his lies." Kelly nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Those are clear objectives, and they help us narrow our approach. Let me outline what I think our best strategy would be." Over the next hour, Kelly mapped out a comprehensive 3-phase plan that addressed each of my goals while maintaining maximum leverage at every stage. "Phase 1 is information gathering and strategic positioning," she explained. "We've already begun this with the emergency orders to freeze assets and secure the house. The next step is a complete forensic accounting of all marital finances, legitimate and hidden." Samuel, who had joined the call midway through, weighed in on the financial aspects. "Based on what we've uncovered so far, I estimate Steven has diverted at least $1.2 million from both marital assets and client funds over the past 3 years. The properties held in Anna's name add another $900,000 in concealed assets, all of which should be subject to division in the divorce proceedings," Kelly added. "Under the laws of your state, assets acquired during marriage, even those deliberately hidden, are considered marital property." "What about the money he stole from clients?" I asked, the ethical implications weighing on me. "That brings us to phase 2, Kelly continued. "Strategic disclosure and negotiation. Once we have comprehensive documentation of Steven's financial misconduct, we create a settlement proposal that includes full financial disclosure, client restitution, and a division of assets that acknowledges his misconduct." Eric joined the discussion at this point, his gruff voice adding a note of pragmatism. "The key is timing. We want to approach him with our settlement offer at precisely the moment when the pressure is highest, but before he realizes the full extent of what we know. How do we determine that moment? Joan asked. That's where the second phone becomes crucial, Eric explained. We're monitoring his communications with Anna. Based on their recent exchanges, he believes you're still focused on grieving your mother and hasn't realized you've discovered his financial improprieties. He's planning to file for divorce next week, I added, recalling the texts Joan had shown me. He thinks he'll control the process because he's prepared and I'm not. Kelly smiled thinly. Perfect. We'll let him file, wait 48 hours for him to feel secure in his position, then counter with our complete package of evidence and demands. What if he refuses to settle? I asked, the possibility nagging at me. Then we move to phase 3, Kelly said, her tone hardening slightly. Full exposure and litigation. We file complaints with the SEC and the state licensing board regarding the client fund misappropriation. We petition the court for full disclosure of all financial improprieties as part of the divorce proceedings, and we ensure that any attempt to seal the records is vigorously opposed. Would that work? Joan asked skeptically. Not all records can be kept public, Kelly acknowledged. But in cases involving financial fraud, courts often allow greater transparency. And frankly, even the threat of public exposure is usually enough to bring an adversary back to the settlement table. As the strategy session continued, we refined the plan further, addressing potential challenges and contingencies. Samuel would accelerate the forensic accounting process, focusing first on documenting the most egregious examples of financial misconduct. Eric would continue monitoring Steven's communications while also gathering evidence about his ongoing activities. Kelly, meanwhile, would prepare a comprehensive settlement proposal that included not just financial terms, but also conditions regarding disclosure and restitution. The beauty of this approach, she explained as we wrapped up, is that it gives Steven the illusion of choice while actually controlling the narrative at every step. He can choose to settle quietly with fair terms, or he can face public exposure and potentially criminal consequences. But either way, you achieve your objectives. After the call ended, Joan squeezed my hand. How are you feeling about all this? I considered the question carefully. The plan Kelly had outlined was aggressive, calculated to leverage every advantage we had discovered. It would expose Steven's deception completely, force him to make restitution, and ensure I received everything I was legally entitled to. But it would also be confrontational, potentially messy, and would require me to stand firm against someone who had once been the center of my world. I searched for the right word. Resolved. This isn't about vengeance. It's about justice and truth. Steven made his choices repeatedly over years. Now, he needs to face the consequences of those choices. Joan nodded approvingly. That's my girl. That afternoon, I received a text from Steven, the first direct communication since our phone call before my mother's funeral. We need to discuss divorce arrangements. My lawyer will be contacting yours. Hope we can keep this civil. The breathtaking audacity of his message, the assumption that I would simply follow his lead, that I would prioritize civility over justice after his profound betrayal, crystallized my determination. I showed Joan the text, a wry smile tugging at my lips. He still thinks I'm the same person I was before, the accommodating wife who avoids conflict at all costs. Little does he know, Joan replied with a satisfied smile. Little does he know, I agreed, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. The path ahead would be challenging, but for the first time since my world had shattered, I felt fully equipped to face it. Steven had spent years weaving an intricate web of lies and manipulation. Now I would methodically dismantle it, thread by thread, until the truth stood exposed in the light, and he would never see it coming. Just as Kelly had predicted, Steven's divorce petition arrived 3 days later. The courier who delivered it, seemed almost apologetic as he handed me the thick envelope with its official court stamps. I thanked him, closed the door, and took a deep breath before opening it. The contents were exactly what we'd expected, a standard no-fault divorce filing with a settlement proposal attached that was breathtaking in its audacity. Steven was claiming 60% of our marital assets, including half the value of the house. He now knew was solely in my name. He offered minimal spousal support for just 1 year, justified by what he called my ability to support myself through employment. Most galling of all was a personal note he'd attached. "Lydia, I hope you'll see this as fair. I'm trying to make this as painless as possible for both of us. Please don't turn this into a battle nobody wins." Steve and I scanned the documents into my laptop and sent them to Kelly with a brief message. "The wolf comes dressed as a reasonable man." Her reply was swift. Perfect timing. "Samuel completed the initial financial analysis this morning. We're ready to proceed with Phase 1, Phase E." One began that afternoon. While Steven believed I was reviewing his divorce proposal, Kelly filed a comprehensive counter-petition with the court, documenting the fraudulent financial activities we'd uncovered and requesting emergency orders for full financial disclosure. Simultaneously, Samuel submitted a forensic accounting report identifying specific instances of fund misappropriation and asset concealment. "The beauty of filing this way," Kelly explained during our evening call, "is that Steven won't be notified immediately. Court processing takes a few days, which gives us time to implement the next steps while he still believes he's controlling the narrative." Those next steps began the following morning. Eric's team deployed financial tracking software to monitor any unusual activity in the accounts we knew about, while also establishing surveillance on Steven himself. Meanwhile, I began the delicate process of meeting with my bank, investment firm, and insurance company to secure my personal financial assets and ensure Steven couldn't access them. The bank manager's expression when I explained the situation was a mixture of sympathy and alarm. "Unfortunately, we see this more often than you might think," she said, her fingers flying over her keyboard as she updated my account protections, "but rarely with this level of preparation on the customer's part. By the end of the day, I had new accounts Steven couldn't access, updated passwords and security protocols on my existing accounts, and a direct line to the bank's fraud department if any suspicious activity occurred. I also returned to work, meeting with my boss to explain that I would need a flexible schedule for the next few weeks, as I dealt with both my mother's estate and my impending divorce. Thomas, who had known me for 7 years and had met Steven at numerous company functions, was unexpectedly supportive. "Take whatever time you need," he said, his usual brisk manner softened by concern. "And Lydia, for what it's worth, I never liked that husband of yours. Too smug by half." I laughed despite myself. "Apparently, a lot of people saw what I missed." Thomas shook his head. "You didn't miss it. You chose to see the best in him. There's a difference." On day 3 of our plan's implementation, the first direct confrontation occurred. I was reviewing project specifications at my desk when my cell phone rang, Steven's name lighting up the screen. I had been expecting this call. Eric had warned me that Steven had received notification of our court filings that morning. I answered with deliberate calm. "Hello, Steven." "What the hell is this?" he demanded, skipping any pretense of civility. "I just got a call from my lawyer about some insane court filing you've submitted. Fraud allegations? Hidden assets? Have you lost your mind?" "I've found it, actually," I replied evenly. "Along with quite a lot of financial evidence you probably wished stayed hidden." There was a moment of silence, then a change in his tone. The shift to the reasonable, persuasive voice he'd used countless times when trying to manage a difficult situation. "Lydia, I don't know what you think you've found, but this is a dangerous road you're going down. Making false accusations." "They're not false, Steven," I interrupted, my voice steady. "We have the offshore account records. We have the property deeds in Anna's name. We have the documented transfers from client accounts. We have all of it." Another. Silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, there was a new edge to his voice. Concern mingled with calculation. Whatever you think you know, there are explanations. Things aren't as black and white as they might appear. We should talk about this in person, not through lawyers. That's not going to happen, I said firmly. Any communication needs to go. Through Kelly Reynolds now. That shark? He scoffed. She's just trying to escalate this to increase her fees. You're smarter than that, Lydia. The attempt at manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. This was the Steven I knew, always trying to manage perceptions, to position himself as the reasonable party while subtly undermining anyone who challenged him. My intelligence isn't in question here, Steven. Your ethics are. And for the record, Kelly's fees are well worth every penny for the financial impropriety she's uncovered. This is ridiculous, he snapped, the reasonable facade cracking further. You're turning a simple divorce into some kind of witch hunt because you're angry about Anna. I get that you're hurt, but this isn't about Anna, I cut in. Or not, just about her. This is about years of lies, financial fraud, and betrayal. This is about the child you had with her while still married to me. The silence that followed told me everything. He hadn't known we were aware of the child. It was the one piece of information we deliberately held back from the initial court filing, saving it as a strategic revelation for precisely this moment. How did you, he began, then stopped himself. Whatever you think you know, we know everything, Steven, I said quietly. Every account, every property, every lie, and we're just getting started. I ended the call before he could respond, my heart pounding, but my resolve stronger than ever. According to our plan, this confrontation would send Steven scrambling, checking accounts, contacting Anna, trying to assess exactly how much we knew and how we discovered it. Let him panic, Kelly had advised. Every move he makes in response will only strengthen our position. Sure enough, within 30 minutes, Eric sent me a text. Subject: moving money between accounts. Documented. Also made 3 calls to offshore. Numbers. Surveillance continuing. Phase 1 was proceeding exactly as planned. Steven was reacting, not strategizing, exactly where we wanted him to be. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset with a glass of wine, my phone pinged. With a message from a number I didn't recognize. This is Anna. We need to talk. I smiled into my wine glass. Phase 2 was about to begin. I stared at Anna's text message for a long moment, then forwarded it to Kelly with the question, should I respond? Her reply came quickly. Yes, but carefully. Suggest a public meeting place. Record everything. Don't. Go alone. After consulting with Kelly and Eric, I crafted a response that was deliberately neutral. I'm willing to meet. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Riverside Cafe downtown. Anna's agreement came within minutes. Joan immediately volunteered to accompany me, but Kelly suggested someone less recognizable to Steven would be better. We don't want him to know you're meeting if Anna tells him, she explained. And so at 1:45 the following afternoon, I found myself sitting at a corner table in the busy cafe. Eric's associate, a woman in her 30s named Melissa, who could easily blend in as a friend, seated at the next table, her phone positioned to record our conversation. Anna arrived precisely at 2, and I was struck again by how different she was from what I'd expected. In my imagination, Steven's mistress had taken on almost mythical proportions, more beautiful, more sophisticated, more everything than me. The reality was more mundane, a woman roughly my age, attractive but not stunningly so, dressed in business. Casual attire, her expression a mixture of determination and unease. Thank you for meeting me, she said, sliding into the seat across from me. She placed her handbag on the table, angled in a way that made me immediately suspicious it contained a recording device of her own. What did you want to discuss? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Anna glanced around, then leaned forward slightly. I think we should talk about how to resolve this situation without things getting ugly. Steven says you're making some serious accusations. Not accusations. Facts, I corrected her. Facts supported by substantial evidence. She shifted uncomfortably. Look, I understand you're hurt. Finding out about us. The way you did was terrible. Steven handled everything badly, and I'm sorry for my part in that. Are you sorry about moving into my house while I was with my dying mother? I asked, unable to keep a slight edge from my voice. Or just sorry I came home early and caught you? A flush crept up her neck. I deserve that. But Lydia, can I call you Lydia? This doesn't have to get messier than it already is. Whatever you think Steven's done. I know what he's done, I interrupted. The question is how much you know. Are you aware of where the money came from for the condo in your name? Or the beach house in Oregon? Or the trust fund for your child? Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly, confirmation that she'd been at least partially in the dark about the source of Steven's wealth. Steven has been very successful in his investments, she said carefully. He's built his business from nothing. I couldn't help the small, incredulous laugh that escaped me. Is that what he told you? That he built his business? Steven joined an established firm 7 years ago. He brought no clients with him. Everything he has, he either married into or stole. Anna's expression hardened slightly. I didn't come here to listen to you disparage him. Why did you come, Anna? To convince me to drop the financial fraud claims? To protect Steven? Or to protect yourself? She sat back, reassessing. Me. I could almost see her adjusting her approach, realizing I wasn't the emotional, easily manipulated woman she'd expected. I came to suggest a compromise, she finally said. One that would benefit all of us. Steven is prepared to be generous. In the divorce settlement, if you'll withdraw the more inflammatory accusations. Generous with whose money? I asked pointedly. The funds he embezzled from his clients? The marital assets he hid from me? Or perhaps the money from selling property that isn't legally his to sell? Anna's confident facade cracked slightly. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating directly that Steven has been committing financial fraud for years, and anyone who knowingly benefits from that fraud could potentially face legal consequences themselves. The color drained from her face. That's absurd. You're trying to intimidate me. No, I'm trying to make you understand the seriousness of the situation. This isn't just about a messy divorce or a husband's infidelity. This is about criminal activity that could result in prosecution. Anna's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach in a protective gesture, and I suddenly realized what I hadn't noticed. Before, she was pregnant again. How far along are you? I asked more gently. She looked startled, then resigned. 4 months. How did you know? Intuition, I said, the revelation adding a new dimension to her desperation to resolve the situation. Quickly. Anna, I don't want to hurt you or your children, but I won't be manipulated or threatened, and I won't allow Steven to escape the consequences of his actions. He says you're just bitter, she said, but with less conviction than before. That, you're making up financial improprieties because you're angry about our relationship. I have documentation of every allegation I've made, I replied. Bank transfers, property deeds, client account records. Does that sound like something I've made up out of bitterness? Anna was silent for a long moment, her eyes focused on the table between us. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. The confident emissary replaced by a woman confronting an uncomfortable possibility. If, hypothetically, what you're saying is true, she said carefully, what happens now? I considered my response, aware that this conversation was likely to be reported back to Steven verbatim. That depends partly on Steven's next move. If he continues trying to hide assets and deceive the court, things will escalate. If he chooses to be transparent and make restitution, there may be a path forward that doesn't involve criminal charges. And what about me? My children? The vulnerability in her voice was genuine, cutting through my residual anger. As I said, I have no desire to hurt innocent people caught in Steven's deception, but I would suggest you consult your own attorney, not Steven's, about your legal position. Soon. Our conversation continued for another 15 minutes, growing increasingly strained as Anna realized she wasn't going to intimidate or persuade me into backing down. When she finally left, I remained at the table, processing the encounter and waiting for Melissa to confirm she'd successfully recorded everything. She was recording too, Melissa noted as she joined me, sliding a small device across the table. Standard issue, easy to detect. Eric will want to analyze both recordings to make sure they match, in case she or Steven tries to selectively edit. Nodded, mentally exhausted from maintaining my composure throughout the confrontation. She's pregnant again. That complicates things. Melissa's expression softened slightly. Maybe for her. Doesn't change what he did. No, I agreed, but it makes the collateral damage more significant. As I walked back to my car, my phone rang, Kelly calling for an immediate update. Anna was definitely sent by Steven, I told her, describing the meeting in detail. But I think she's starting to realize she doesn't have the full picture. She seemed genuinely shocked by some of what I told her. That's consistent with what we're seeing in their text exchanges, Kelly confirmed. She's asking him questions, now that she wasn't before. Creating doubt between them works in our favor. What's our next move? I asked, pulling into traffic. We wait, Kelly said simply. The court has scheduled an emergency hearing on the asset freeze for tomorrow morning. Steven's lawyer will be there arguing against it. Once the judge rules, which I expect will be in our favor given the evidence, we'll see how Steven reacts. That will determine our next steps. I ended the call feeling emotionally drained but strangely empowered. The confrontation with Anna had been difficult, but I'd held my ground, maintained my composure, and possibly even planted seeds of doubt that could fracture Steven's support system. It was a small victory, but right now, I'd take whatever wins I could get. The real battle was just beginning. The courthouse loomed before me, its stone facade imposing in the morning light. I'd never been to a court hearing before, had never imagined myself as part of the legal dramas that unfolded within those walls. Yet here I was, dressed in a conservative navy suit, my mother's locket around my neck like a talisman, about to face my husband in a legal battle over the ruins of our marriage. Remember, you don't need to speak unless directly addressed by the judge, Kelly reminded me as we climbed the steps. I'll handle all the arguments. Your presence alone sends the message that you're fully engaged in this process. Inside, the courtroom was less dramatic than television had led me to expect. No soaring ceilings or ornate woodwork, just a functional, modern space with fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable wooden benches. I sat beside Kelly at the plaintiff's table, keeping my gaze forward as Steven and his attorney, Andrew Blackwell, entered and took their places at the defense table. I could feel Steven's eyes on me, but I refused to look his way. This was the first time we'd been in the same room since I'd kicked him out of the house, and I was determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing any emotional reaction from me. Judge Patricia Morris entered, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair and piercing eyes that seemed to miss nothing. After the formalities, she addressed the purpose of the hearing directly. We're here on plaintiff's emergency motion to freeze all assets connected to the marriage of Lydia and Steven Calloway, based on allegations of financial impropriety and concealment. Ms. Reynolds, you may proceed. Kelly rose, the very picture of professional competence, and laid out our case with devastating precision. She presented the evidence of hidden accounts, property held in Anna's name, and suspicious transfers from client accounts, all documented in the exhibits we'd filed with the court. Your Honor, this is not simply a matter of a spouse hiding a few assets during divorce proceedings, which would be concerning enough. This is a systematic pattern of financial fraud that potentially impacts innocent third parties, including Mr. Calloway's investment clients. Andrew Blackwell, a polished man in his 50s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to winning, countered by portraying me as emotionally unstable, devastated by my mother's death, and lashing out with unfounded accusations. Mr. Calloway's financial activities are complex but entirely legitimate, he argued smoothly. The plaintiff has misinterpreted standard investment practices as nefarious activities because she lacks financial sophistication and is motivated by understandable but misplaced anger over the end of her marriage. The condescension in his tone made my blood boil, but I maintained my composed expression, just as Kelly had coached me. Judge Morris, however, seemed less than impressed by Blackwell's dismissive characterization. I've reviewed the forensic accounting report submitted by the plaintiff, she said, adjusting her glasses. Mr. Weiss is a highly respected expert whose analysis raises significant concerns that go well beyond a layperson's misinterpretation. Mr. Blackwell, do you have evidence to directly refute these findings? Blackwell hesitated, just slightly before responding. Your Honor, we haven't had sufficient time to conduct our own comprehensive analysis, but then perhaps you should have requested more time before dismissing the allegations as unfounded. Judge Morris interrupted. Based on the evidence before me, I'm granting the emergency motion to freeze all assets pending a full accounting. Furthermore, I'm ordering Mr. Calloway to provide complete financial records for all accounts, domestic and international, within 7 days. She fixed Steven with a stern look. Mr. Calloway, the court takes allegations of financial misrepresentation very seriously. I strongly advise full cooperation with this order. As we left the courtroom, I finally allowed myself to glance at Steven. His face was rigid with barely controlled fury, his eyes cold as they met mine. It was a look I'd never seen directed at me before, pure, unadulterated hatred. Don't let it rattle you, Kelly murmured as we walked toward the exit. That look means we've hit him where it hurts. Back at Kelly's office, we received the first indication that our victory had significant consequences. Eric called with news. That monitoring of Steven's secret phone had revealed frantic communications with various financial contacts. He's trying to move money that's already been frozen, Eric reported. And he's not being subtle about it. We've documented 3 separate attempts to transfer funds from the Cayman account to a new account in Singapore. Perfect, Kelly said, her expression satisfied. That's a direct violation of the court order. If he persists, we can motion for contempt. But our triumph was short-lived. Later that afternoon, Samuel called with disturbing news. There's a problem, he said without preamble. I've been tracing the client fund diversions and I've discovered something concerning. Some of the missing money, about $350,000, was taken from accounts belonging to a man named Richard Daniels. He's my boss's father, I finished, my stomach dropping. Thomas's dad is one of Steven's clients? Was, Samuel corrected grimly. Richard Daniels died 4 months ago, and from what I can tell, Steven has been systematically emptying his investment account since then, likely assuming no one would notice since the primary account holder is deceased. I sat heavily in one of Kelly's office chairs, the implications, hitting me like a physical blow. Thomas is the executor of his father's estate. If he finds out Steven has been stealing from his dead father... It gets worse, Samuel continued. The estate is in probate, which means there will be a formal accounting any day now. When that happens, the missing funds will be discovered, regardless of what we do. Kelly's expression turned grave. This changes our timeline. We were planning to use the threat of exposing the client fraud as leverage in settlement negotiations. But if the Daniels situation is about to explode on its own, we need to get ahead of it, I said firmly, my mind racing. I need to tell Thomas before he finds out another way. Kelly looked uncertain. That's risky. Once you disclose the fraud to a victim, you lose the ability to control how they respond. He could go straight to the authorities. He could, I acknowledged. But Thomas has been my mentor for 7 years. I owe him the truth directly from me. And strategically. I hesitated, an idea forming. Strategically, it might actually strengthen our position if the first criminal complaint comes from someone other than me. It makes the fraud allegations more credible if they're not just coming from the angry, soon-to-be ex-wife. Kelly considered this, then nodded slowly. You may be right, but we need to be careful about how the information is presented. We don't want it to appear that you're using your professional relationship to further your divorce case. We spent the next hour outlining a new approach, a significant pivot from our original strategy. Instead of holding the client fraud evidence as leverage, we would begin selective disclosure to the most severely impacted clients, providing them with documentation of the misappropriated funds and options for recourse. This changes our primary leverage, Kelly acknowledged, but it may actually accelerate the resolution. Once Steven realizes he's facing multiple fraud complaints from different sources, he may be more motivated to cooperate with our settlement terms to avoid criminal prosecution. That evening, I requested a private meeting with Thomas for the following morning. Then I called Joan, needing the comfort of talking through my conflicted feelings with someone who understood the personal stakes involved. I'm doing the right thing by telling Thomas, I said, seeking reassurance. But it feels like I'm crossing a line, bringing my personal disaster into my professional life. The line was crossed by Steven, not you, Joan reminded me gently. You're just dealing with the fallout as honestly as you can. After we hung up, I sat on my porch swing, watching the sunset and wrestling with the implications of our strategic pivot. The path ahead had just become more complicated, more public, and potentially more damaging to all involved, including innocent people like Thomas and Anna's children. But maybe that had always been inevitable. The magnitude of Steven's deception meant that containing the damage was never truly possible. All I could do now was try to ensure that justice was served while minimizing harm to those who, like me, had been caught in the crossfire of his lies. Tomorrow would bring hard conversations and unpredictable consequences. But for the first time since discovering Steven's betrayal, I felt fully committed to the course I'd chosen, not just for my own sake, but for everyone he had wronged. The time for half measures and strategic silence was over. The truth, in all its ugly complexity, needed to come to light. Thomas's office had always felt like a sanctuary to me, a place where problems had clear solutions, where competence was valued above all else. Now, as I sat across from his desk with a folder of documents in my lap, that familiar space felt charged with a tension I'd never experienced there before. This sounds serious, Lydia, Thomas said, his usual brisk manner tempered by concern. What's going on? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I've discovered something about my husband that directly affects you and your family. It's about your father's investment accounts. Thomas's expression shifted, alert and cautious. What about them? Steven has been siphoning funds from them since your father's death, I said, forcing myself to maintain eye contact as I delivered this devastating news. I have documentation showing withdrawals of approximately $350,000 over the past 4 months. For a moment, Thomas stared at me in disbelief. Then he reached for the folder I offered, opening it with hands that weren't quite steady. I waited silently as he reviewed the bank statements, transfer records, and Samuel's forensic analysis, his face growing progressively more rigid with anger. "You're certain of this?" he finally asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Yes," I confirmed. "The records are clear. And Thomas, your father isn't the only victim. We've identified at least 12 other clients whose accounts have been similarly depleted." He sat back in his chair, processing the implications. "How did you discover this?" I explained about my mother's investigation, the evidence she'd gathered, and how it had led to the broader financial review during my divorce proceedings. I was careful to emphasize that I'd come to him immediately upon discovering his father was involved. "I'm so sorry," I concluded. "I know this is a shock, and I hate to be the one telling you this, but I felt you deserved to hear it from me directly, rather than discovering it during the probate process." Thomas was silent for a long moment, tapping his fingers on the desk in the rhythmic pattern I knew signaled he was thinking deeply. Finally, he looked up, his expression resolute. "I appreciate your coming to me with this, Lydia. It couldn't have been easy." He gestured to the documents. "May I keep these?" "Of course," I said. "And if you decide to take action, my forensic accountant is prepared to provide any additional information you might need." "Oh, I'll be taking action," Thomas assured me, his voice hardening. "Starting with a call to my attorney, followed by one to the police. This isn't just theft, it's desecration. He stole from my dead father." The raw pain in his voice made my throat tighten. "I understand, and I'll support whatever course you choose to take." As I left Thomas's office, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at having done the right thing, sadness for the additional pain my husband had caused, and a growing certainty that our strategic pivot had just accelerated the timeline. Dramatically, I was right. By that evening, Kelly called to inform me that Thomas had indeed filed a police report and a formal complaint with the State Securities Commission. Additionally, his attorney had contacted the district attorney's office to discuss potential criminal charges. "This is moving faster than even I anticipated," Kelly admitted. "The DA's office has already reached out to Samuel requesting his forensic analysis, and they've indicated they'll be contacting us for a formal statement from you." "Is that good? Or bad for our case?" I asked. "Both," Kelly said pragmatically. "It's good because it validates our allegations and puts tremendous pressure on Steven. It's potentially complicated because once criminal proceedings begin, they can sometimes delay civil matters like divorce settlements. But overall, I think this strengthens our position considerably," she confirmed, "especially since we initiated the disclosure proactively. It shows good faith on your part." The next day brought a flurry of developments. Eric reported that Steven's secret phone was blowing up with increasingly panicked messages, not just from Anna, but from financial contacts warning him about account freezes and regulatory inquiries. Samuel called to inform us that 2 other clients had come forward with concerns about their accounts after being contacted by the Securities Commission investigators. Most significantly, Steven's attorney requested an urgent meeting with Kelly to discuss settlement options, a clear indication that our strategy was having the desired effect. "He's feeling the walls closing in," Kelly observed during our pre-meeting strategy session. "The question is whether he's ready to surrender or just looking for a way to buy time." She advised me not to attend the initial meeting. "Let's keep you as the reasonable but firm party in the background," but promised a full report immediately afterward. While Kelly met with Andrew Blackwell, I busied myself with a long-postponed task, sorting through my mother's personal belongings that Joan had shipped from Milwaukee. Each item carried memories: her favorite cardigan, still holding traces of her perfume, the dog-eared copy of Jane Eyre she read annually, the handwritten recipe cards passed down from my grandmother. As I carefully organized these treasures, I found myself talking aloud to my mother, sharing my fears and hopes about the path I'd chosen. "I wish you could tell me if I'm doing the right thing," I said softly, holding her locket in my palm. "If this is what you would have wanted." My phone rang, interrupting my reverie. Kelly calling from her car after the meeting with Blackwell. "It's significant," she said without preamble. "Steven is offering a complete financial disclosure, full cooperation with the Securities Commission investigation, and a settlement that gives you 70% of all marital assets." I sat down abruptly, stunned by the sudden shift. "That's unexpected. What's the catch?" "He wants confidentiality regarding the affair and Anna's pregnancy. And he's asking that you make a statement to the DA indicating you believe he intended to return the client funds eventually." I frowned, considering the implications. He wants me to help mitigate the criminal charges. Essentially, yes, Kelly confirmed. He's facing serious legal consequences regardless, but your statement could potentially influence whether he faces the maximum penalties. What did you tell Blackwell? That we'd consider the offer and respond within 48 hours, Kelly said. I wanted to discuss it with you first. This is ultimately your decision, Lydia. After ending the call, I returned to my mother's belongings, my mind churning with conflicting thoughts. Steven's offer was far more generous than we'd initially hoped for financially. The question was whether I could, in good conscience, help lessen the consequences for his criminal actions, even slightly. As I lifted a small wooden box from the packing materials, something fell out. A photograph I'd never seen before. It showed my mother as a young woman, standing proudly in front of her first apartment, her expression radiating independence and hope. On the back, she'd written, "First day on my own, scared but free." I stared at the image, something clicking into place. My mother had always encouraged my independence, had insisted on protections like keeping the house in my name alone. She'd investigated Steven not out of vindictiveness, but to ensure I could make informed choices about my life. What would she advise now? The answer came with surprising clarity. She would tell me to choose freedom over vengeance, future over past. Picked up my phone and called Kelly back. I've made my decision, I said, my voice steady with newfound certainty. Tell Blackwell we have a counteroffer. 3 days after Kelly delivered our counteroffer, I found myself sitting in a conference room at her office, waiting for Steven and his attorney to arrive for the face-to-face meeting that would potentially end our legal battle. The table was arranged with deliberate precision, documents stacked neatly, water glasses placed at exact intervals, the physical embodiment of Kelly's meticulous approach. Remember, Kelly advised as we waited, this meeting is about finalizing details, not reopening negotiations. The framework is already agreed upon. If Steven attempts to deviate from what we've outlined, we walk away. I nodded, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my charcoal gray dress, a new purchase that Joan had insisted upon for this occasion. You need armor, she'd said while we shopped. Something that makes you feel powerful. The structured silhouette and subtle elegance of the dress did exactly that, providing an external confidence to match my internal resolve. When Steven entered alongside Andrew Blackwell, I was struck by how different he looked from the man I'd married. Just weeks of facing consequences had visibly aged him. New lines etched around his mouth, dark circles beneath his eyes, his normally immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. He met my gaze briefly, then looked away, unable or unwilling to maintain eye contact. The initial exchanges were formal and tense, with both attorneys reviewing the settlement terms we'd negotiated. I would receive the house in Portland plus 65% of all marital assets. Steven would retain his retirement accounts and the smaller of our investment portfolios. And most importantly, I would provide a statement to the district attorney indicating that I believed Steven had intended the B client fund borrowing to be temporary. In exchange, Steven would make full financial disclosure, cooperate completely with regulatory investigations, and accept responsibility for his actions. The divorce would proceed as uncontested, with none of the salacious details of his relationship, with Anna made public. Before we sign, Kelly said, sliding the final settlement document across the table, Ms. Calloway has requested 5 minutes to speak privately with her husband. Blackwell frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. I'm not sure that's advisable at this stage. It's non-negotiable, Kelly replied smoothly. 5 minutes in this room. You and I will wait outside. After a moment of tense silence, Steven nodded. It's fine, Andrew. I'll hear what she has to say. The attorneys left, closing the door behind them, and suddenly we were alone for the first time since I'd ordered him out of the house. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all that had been broken. "Why did you want to speak to me?" Steven finally asked, his voice carefully controlled. I took a measured breath, centering myself. "I wanted to look you in the eye when I ask, was any of it real? Our marriage, our plans, our life together? Was any of it genuine?" He flinched slightly, clearly not expecting such a direct question. "Of course it was real. I did love you, Lydia. Just not enough," I said quietly. "Not enough to be faithful, to be honest, to honor the promises you made." Steven's expression hardened. "Is that what you wanted? To make me say it out loud? Yes, I failed as a husband. Yes, I lied to you. Are you satisfied now?" "This isn't about satisfaction," I replied, maintaining my composure despite the anger simmering beneath his words. "It's about understanding. For 10 years, I built my life around a man who was living a complete lie. I need to know why." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache despite everything. "It wasn't planned, if that's what you're thinking. Things with Anna, they just happened. And once they started, I couldn't seem to stop. It was like living 2 different lives." "And the stealing?" I pressed. "Did that just happen too?" A flush crept up his neck. "I never thought of it as stealing. Not really. I was just moving money around, borrowing from accounts that weren't being actively monitored. I always intended to replace it once some investments paid off." The casual way he dismissed his theft was breathtaking. Those were people's life savings, Steven. Thomas's father's legacy to his family. My mother's friend, Mrs. Abernathy's retirement fund. Real people, with real lives that you damaged. For the first time, genuine shame flickered across his face. "I know, I got in over my head. The lifestyle, the expenses, it all spiraled. And then Anna got pregnant, and I needed to provide for them too, and—" He trailed off, perhaps, realizing how inadequate any explanation sounded. "Did she know?" I asked. "About the stealing, I mean." He shook his head quickly. "No. She thought it was all legitimate. She still doesn't know the full extent of it even now." I studied him, this stranger I'd shared a bed with for a decade, trying to reconcile the man I'd loved with the person sitting before me. "You've lost everything," I said softly. "Your career, your reputation, possibly your freedom. Was it worth it?" Steven didn't answer immediately, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I'll probably go to prison," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "Even with your statement, the DA says jail time is almost certain. I've lost my license to practice. Most of our friends won't speak to me." He looked up, meeting my eyes. Directly for the first time. "So no, it wasn't worth it. Nothing could be worth this. Then why did you fight so hard when I first filed for divorce? Why not just come clean then?" "Fear," he admitted. "Once you start living a lie, it's terrifying to face the truth. I convinced myself I could still find a way out, that I could fix things without anyone discovering what I'd done." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. Fear was a powerful motivator. Fear of loss, fear of judgment, fear of consequences. I'd known my share of it during our marriage, always afraid of disrupting the perfect image we presented to the world. "I'm sorry about your mother," Steven said unexpectedly. "I should have been there for you, regardless of everything else. That was unforgivable." The simple acknowledgement pierced through my carefully maintained composure, bringing tears to my eyes despite my best efforts. "Yes," I agreed, my voice thick. "It was." We sat in silence for a moment, the air between us heavy with regret and endings. "What will you do now?" he asked. "After all this is settled?" I considered the question, thinking about the plans I'd begun to form. "Live," I said simply. "On my own terms, without pretense or fear. My mother left me a surprising gift in the midst of all this pain, the knowledge that I'm stronger than I ever imagined. Steven nodded, something like respect flickering in his eyes. You are. He reached for the settlement papers, uncapping a pen. For what it's worth, I am sorry, Lydia. Not just for getting caught, but for the hurt I caused. I never thought I was capable of becoming this person. As he signed his name to the document that would legally end our marriage, I felt a curious sense of closure washing over me. The man I'd married was gone, perhaps had never truly existed. But the woman I was becoming was real, forged in the crucible of betrayal and loss, emerging stronger for having survived the fire. When Kelly and Blackwell returned, we completed the formalities with a minimum of additional conversation. Papers were signed, copies distributed, handshakes exchanged with professional detachment. And then it was done. The legal battle concluded, the terms of surrender established. As Steven rose to leave, he paused, looking at me one last time. I hope you find happiness, he said quietly. You deserve that much, at least. I met his gaze steadily. I will, I replied, the words a promise to myself as much as a response to him. I already am. After they departed, Kelly turned to me with a rare smile. It's over, she said. You've won. But as I gathered my things to leave, I realized it wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about survival and transformation, about walking through the wreckage of the life I'd planned and finding the courage to build something new from the ashes. That felt less like victory and more like rebirth, painful, messy, and infinitely more valuable. The days following the settlement agreement passed in a blur of paperwork, meetings, and formal statements. I provided my carefully worded testimony to the district attorney's office, emphasizing that while I believed Steven had intended to return the misappropriated funds, his actions still constituted serious breaches of trust and professional ethics. It was a delicate balance, fulfilling my part of our agreement while still ensuring justice for his victims. You did well, the prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Veronica Diaz, told me after we finished. Your statement was fair, but didn't minimize the gravity of what he did. Will it make a difference in his sentencing? I asked, uncertain whether I wanted it to or not. She considered this thoughtfully. It might reduce the maximum sentence slightly, but make no mistake, he's still facing significant jail time. Financial crimes of this magnitude, with multiple victims and a pattern of deception, aren't treated lightly. I nodded, a complex mix of emotions swirling inside me. Part of me still struggled to reconcile the man I'd married with someone capable of actions deserving prison time. Yet another part knew that consequences were necessary, not just for justice, but for Steven himself to ever rebuild any kind of life afterward. The Securities Commission investigation continued to expand, with more affected clients coming forward. Thomas had become a key figure in coordinating the victims, using his business connections to ensure their voices were heard. He'd been unexpectedly kind to me throughout the process, making it clear he didn't hold me responsible for Steven's actions. If anything, he said during one of our conversations, you're as much a victim as any of us. More so, in some ways. We lost money. You lost the foundation of your life. His words touched me deeply, easing some of the lingering guilt I carried for not having recognized what was happening sooner. No one, not even Thomas, blamed me for Steven's crimes. No one except myself. Kelly helped me navigate the final legal steps of the divorce, which proceeded swiftly now that all contested issues had been resolved. The judge will sign the final decree next week, she informed me during our last official meeting. After that, you'll legally be Lydia Harmon again if you choose to revert to your maiden name. The thought of reclaiming my birth name felt right. AEEI. Symbolic return to myself after years of living as someone else's wife. I do, I confirmed. It's time to be Lydia Harmon again. As the legal matters wound down, I found myself facing the more personal aftermath of the divorce. Joan had been my rock throughout, but I knew she was concerned about my emotional healing. "What's next for you?" she asked one evening as we shared a bottle of wine on my porch swing. "You've been in crisis mode for so long. Have you thought about what comes after?" It was a question I'd been asking myself with increasing frequency. The divorce settlement had left me financially secure. Between the house, the investment accounts, and the unexpected inheritance from my mother, I had more than enough to live comfortably without working if I chose. But the prospect of an empty future stretched before me was daunting. "I'm thinking about taking a sabbatical from work," I admitted. "Maybe travel for a while. There's a world out there I've never seen because I was too busy building a life around Steven's career and our social obligations." Joan nodded encouragingly. "That sounds perfect. Where would you go first?" "Italy," I said without hesitation. My mother always wanted to go to Tuscany. She had this dream of spending a summer there, writing and painting. After my father died, she talked about it sometimes, but she never went. Always too many responsibilities, too many reasons to stay home. "So you'll go for both of you," Joan suggested gently. "Yes," I agreed, the idea taking firmer shape in my mind. "I think I will." As plans for my sabbatical began to form, I received an unexpected call from Anna. My first instinct was to reject it, but curiosity won out. "I hope it's okay that I'm calling," she began, her voice tentative. "I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" I repeated, genuinely confused. "For what?" "For the way you handled everything," she replied. "Steven told me about your statement to the DA, and about how you kept our situation out of the public record. You didn't have to do that." I was silent for a moment, processing her gratitude. "I didn't do it for Steven," I finally said. "Or even for you, really. I did it because dragging your children through public humiliation wouldn't serve any purpose except revenge. And I'm trying to build something better than that." "Still," she persisted, "it was decent of you, especially given how you found out about us." A question that had lingered in my mind for weeks suddenly surfaced. "Did you know I was with my dying mother when you moved in? Did Steven tell you that?" Her sharp intake of breath was answer enough. "No," she said quietly. "He told me you were staying with a friend after a fight, that you'd essentially moved out already." She paused, then added, "I should have questioned it more." Looking back, there were so many things I should have questioned. The confirmation that Steven had lied to her too didn't surprise me, but it did offer a strange kind of closure. His deception had been comprehensive, touching every aspect of his life. "What will you do now?" I asked, echoing the question Steven had posed to me during our final meeting. "Try to build a life for my children," she said simply. "Steven will be in prison when the baby is born. I need to create stability somehow." Despite everything, I felt a flicker of empathy for her. She too had built her life around a lie, and now had to find her way forward in its aftermath. "I wish you luck with that," I said, and found I meant it sincerely. After we hung up, I wandered through my house, not ours anymore, and realized how much it had transformed in the weeks since Steven's departure. I'd redecorated subtly but significantly, replacing the formal aesthetic he'd preferred with warmer colors and more comfortable furnishings. Photos of my mother, my childhood, and my friends now occupied prominent places where once there had been carefully curated artwork chosen to impress guests. The space felt authentically mine in a way it never had before, reflecting my tastes and preferences rather than a compromise designed to maintain marital harmony. It was both symbolic and literal. I was reclaiming not just physical space, but the emotional and psychological territory of my own identity. That evening, I sat down at my mother's old writing desk, which I'd moved from her house to mine after the funeral. and began drafting a letter to my boss requesting a 6-month sabbatical. As the words flowed onto the page, I felt a growing sense of liberation, not just from Steven and the marriage that had constrained me, but from all the expectations and limitations I'd accepted without question for so long. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. Whatever came next would be shaped by my choices, my desires, my vision for my life. The thought was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure, exactly as new beginnings should be. 6 months after the final divorce decree, I stood on a hilltop in Tuscany, watching the sunset paint the rolling landscape in shades of gold and amber. The small villa I'd rented for the summer sat below, nestled among cypress trees and vineyards, exactly as my mother had described in her dreams of this place. The journey here had been more than geographical. In the months since the settlement, I'd methodically rebuilt my life piece by piece, shedding old patterns and embracing new possibilities with each passing day. I'd taken my sabbatical as planned, starting with a month helping Joan launch her new business, a consulting firm specializing in financial literacy for women. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. If I'd had better financial awareness years earlier, perhaps I would have noticed the red flags in Steven's activities sooner. That's exactly why this work matters, Joan had insisted when I shared that thought. Financial independence isn't just about having your own money, it's about understanding it, controlling it, using it to build the life you want, rather than becoming trapped by someone else's decisions. Working with her reminded me how much I'd enjoyed the strategic elements of my architectural project management role, the problem-solving, the creative thinking, the satisfaction of building something meaningful. But it also highlighted how constrained I'd felt in that position, always careful not to outshine Steven professionally, unconsciously dimming my ambitions to maintain the balance he seemed to need in our relationship. Those realizations led to the most significant decision of my post-divorce life, enrolling in a master's program in urban design that would begin after my return from Italy. At 41, I would be starting over in many ways, pursuing the career path I'd abandoned in my 20s to support Steven's ambitions. "It's never too late to become who you might have been," my mother had often said, quoting George Eliot. Now I understood the truth of those words in a way I never had before. My reflections were interrupted by the villa's caretaker calling from below, letting me know the car had arrived to take me to dinner with friends, a group of women I'd met at a cooking class in the nearby village. Women from different countries and backgrounds who had, like me, come to this place seeking transformation of one kind or another. As I made my way down the hill, I thought about the last update I'd received from Kelly. Steven had been sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement, with the possibility of parole after 4 years with good behavior. The news had affected me less than I'd expected. Neither satisfaction nor sorrow, just a quiet acknowledgement of consequences justly applied. Thomas had called to tell me the restitution process for the victims was proceeding smoothly, with most recovering at least 70% of their losses through the seizure of Steven's assets and the insurance claims against his former firm. "You helped make that possible," he'd said. "Your evidence, your testimony, it made all the difference." Even Anna had found her way forward, according to Joan, who had unexpectedly bumped into her at a community center parenting class. She'd moved to a smaller house, found work as an office manager, and was building a support network of other single mothers. Her child with Steven, a daughter, had been born healthy, with no knowledge of the father who would be absent for much of her early life. These updates from my old life felt increasingly distant, like stories about people I'd once known rather than central figures in my own narrative. My focus had shifted to the present and future, to the woman I was becoming rather than the wife I had been. Over dinner with my new friends, conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from Italian architecture to relationship wisdom to career reinvention. These women had become unexpected companions on my journey. Elena from Spain, who had left a toxic marriage at 50, Margot from Canada, who was rebuilding after losing her business, Rachel from South Africa, who was finally pursuing her passion for photography after raising 3 children alone. We shared our stories openly, without judgment or pretense, each recognizing in the others the unique blend of vulnerability and strength that comes from navigating life's unexpected turns. To resilience, Elena proposed a toast, raising her glass of local wine. And to second chances. And to the women who seize them, I added, feeling the truth of it resonating deep within me. Later that night, as I sat on the terrace of my villa, writing in the journal I'd begun keeping since my mother's death, I reflected on how profoundly my perception of myself had changed. The woman who had once defined herself primarily as Stephen Calloway's wife, accommodating, conflict avoidant, quick to compromise her own needs, had been replaced by someone more authentic, more confident, more fully herself. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been days of paralyzing grief, nights of suffocating anger, moments when the weight of betrayal and loss had threatened to pull me under completely. But through it all, something at my core had refused to break. That steel thread of resilience I'd inherited from my mother and grandmother, women who had faced their own trials and emerged stronger. I closed my journal and looked up at the star-filled Tuscan sky, thinking about all the women watching my story unfold. Women perhaps standing at their own crossroads, facing their own versions of betrayal or loss or reinvention. If I could speak directly to them, what would I say? I would tell them that pain, however devastating, is not the end of your story. It's simply a chapter. That the moments that break you can also be the moments that remake you into someone stronger, wiser, and more authentically yourself. I would remind them that financial independence is not just a practical necessity, but a profound form of self-care and protection. That understanding your own finances, securing your own resources, and planning for your own future isn't selfish or untrusting. It's an essential foundation for true equality in any relationship. I would urge them to listen to their intuition, that quiet voice that whispers when something isn't right, even when every logical sign suggests otherwise. Our bodies and minds often recognize truth before we're consciously willing to acknowledge it. I would encourage them to build networks of supportive women who lift each other up rather than compete, friends who celebrate your victories, comfort you in defeat, and tell you the hard truths when necessary. No one survives life's storms alone, and choosing the right people to weather them with you makes all the difference. Most importantly, I would tell them that their value has never been determined by someone else's ability to recognize it. That worthiness isn't earned through another's love or approval, but is intrinsic and unchangeable, a birthright no betrayal can erase. And I would share the most profound lesson of my own journey. That sometimes what feels like an ending is actually the universe clearing space for a new beginning. That sometimes you must lose the life you plan to find the life that's waiting for you. As the Italian night enveloped me in its velvet darkness, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. The past no longer had power over my present. The betrayal that had once defined me had become simply one chapter in a much longer, richer story. A story I was writing myself, one choice at a time. Whatever came next, love or solitude, challenge, or ease, success or setback, I would face it as the woman I had always been beneath the roles and expectations, resilient, worthy, and finally, gloriously free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.